Imagine a man standing at the absolute peak of his profession. He has fought tooth and nail for like 15 grueling years in a ruthless industry to finally secure the ultimate prize.
Right, the starring role.
Exactly. The top billing, the massive paycheck. He is the traditional, undisputed leading man. But then, just a few months into his triumph, he walks onto the lot and discovers that the studio has been actively hiding literal sacks of fan mail from him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And those sacks of mail, they aren't even for him. They are for his strange, quiet, secondary sidekick.
I mean, imagine the absolute psychological terror that would induce.
Right. Especially in a person whose entire survival depends on being the center of attention. Welcome to Retro Celeb Talk.
It's a scenario that sounds like a Hollywood thriller, honestly. But it is the very real foundation of what we were discussing today.
So we're exploring the incredibly complex 50-year relationship between William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy.
And this is a legendary bond that undeniably defined television history.
For sure.
But, to truly understand it, we have to look past the on-screen unity of Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this history is filled with intense rivalry, deeply psychological warfare, fragile egos.
And profound brotherhood, too.
Yeah. And ultimately, a tragic, unresolved fracture. Our mission today is to dig into the historical record, to understand how the ultimate pop culture friendship was actually forged in the fires of intense professional jealousy.
We're going to look at the psychological mechanics behind the scenes, the boardroom battles, and how an eventual loss of ego turned bitter rivals into the closest of brothers.
So let's jump into the history.
To genuinely grasp the magnitude of their eventual falling out, you really have to understand how strikingly similar these two men were before they even stepped onto a soundstage together.
It's almost weird how similar they were.
It is. What's fascinating here is how the 1960s Hollywood machine deliberately pitted their roles against each other, setting up a classic alpha versus outlier dynamic.
Right.
But their origins were practically cosmic in their parallels.
The similarities in their beginnings almost feel scripted. You have these two men born just 4 days apart in March of 1931.
4 days.
Yeah. And the geographic and cultural similarities are staggering. Shatner is born in Montreal, Nimoy in Boston, but they are both born into Orthodox, Yiddish-speaking Jewish families of Ukrainian immigrants.
And this isn't just a biographical footnote. This is the entire engine of their psychology.
How so?
Well, when you look at the cultural landscape of the 1930s for Eastern European immigrants, you are looking at a deeply ingrained survival mindset.
Oh, right. The immigrant work ethic in its purest, most desperate form.
Exactly. We aren't just talking about a strong desire to succeed. We are talking about a shared psychological trait of extreme workaholism that was driven by generational trauma.
Right, because when your family has fled pogroms and systemic erasure, the message passed down to the children is pretty clear.
It's basically, you must work constantly, you must achieve undeniable value, or everything can be taken from you in an instant.
There's an anecdote in our documentation that perfectly illustrates the depth of this inherited terror. Let's fast forward a bit to the 1970s, right at the absolute height of Nimoy's global fame.
Okay.
A Russian ambassador formally invites Nimoy's parents to accompany their famous son back to their home village in Ukraine for a visit.
Wow. On paper, that is the ultimate triumphant return, right?
You'd think so. The ultimate PR victory. But Nimoy's parents flatly refused to go.
Wait, really? They said no.
They didn't just decline, they were utterly terrified. They genuinely believed the entire invitation was an elaborate, decades-long trap designed to lure them back.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, to put them in prison for having sneaked out of the country in a hay cart 60 years earlier.
That is heartbreaking.
It really is. They let their son go alone because that generational fear was so paralyzing, so real to them, and both Shatner and Nimoy carried that exact same inherited anxiety into their early careers.
It was a relentless, quiet terror pushing them forward. So imagine carrying that weight into the grueling reality of the 1950s and 60s TV grind.
Oh, man. They both started acting professionally around 1951, right?
Yeah, and for over a decade, they are out there hustling. They're crisscrossing in the television landscape, doing guest spots on The Twilight Zone, Gunsmoke, Alfred Hitchcock Presents.
They were blue-collar actors fighting for every paycheck.
Exactly. And their first actual meeting on camera wasn't until a 1964 episode of The Man from UNCLE.
Oh, right. Shatner was playing an agency recruit, and Nimoy was playing an antagonistic villain.
But the dynamic that would eventually define their legendary collaboration was entirely dictated by the 1960s star system.
Here's where it gets really interesting. You have to understand how rigid the vertical hierarchy of television was back then.
It wasn't the ensemble-driven, collaborative prestige TV you might be used to seeing today.
Not at all. There was an absolute top of the pyramid, and everyone else was just supporting scaffolding.
And William Shatner was hired to be the absolute peak of that pyramid. He was cast as the alpha.
The studio basically molded him as the undisputed leading man, the traditional mid-century heroic ideal.
Right. He had classical Shakespearean training from his time at the Stratford Festival in Canada. He had the square jaw.
And he was the narrative engine of the entire franchise. Everything revolved around his character's passion and action.
And the studio compensated him according to that supreme status. His initial contract was an astronomical $5,000 a week.
Plus a 5% profit participation.
Exactly. He was the highly paid, undisputed star.
In direct contrast, you have the outlier, Leonard Nimoy.
Cast as the secondary character, a quote-unquote satanic-looking alien.
Right, whose entire narrative purpose initially was purely functional. He was just there to provide dry technical exposition so that the captain's passionate humanity would shine brighter by comparison.
And his initial contract reflects that lower rung on the ladder.
Yeah.
$1,250 a week.
With absolutely zero profit participation.
Zero.
But, I want to push back on the idea that the studio's rigid hierarchy was the sole cause of the friction. Yeah, because when you put two actors with such completely divergent acting methodologies in the same room, isn't conflict somewhat inevitable?
That's a fair point.
I mean, you have Shatner, who is projecting his theatrical Shakespearean energy to the back row. And then you have Nimoy, who is a devoted method actor, internalizing everything, trying to find the quiet, emotional truth of a deeply repressed alien.
It's a huge clash of styles.
It's like having two incredible musicians in a band, but one is playing a bombastic marching tune in 44 time, and the other is playing a complex jazz rhythm in 78. They are fundamentally out of sync.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that rhythmic clash of their acting styles was absolutely the kindling. Method acting requires a complete immersion into the internal reality of the character.
While classical theatrical acting often relies on external presentation and dominating the space.
Right. But what truly ignited that kindling into a massive inferno was an unprecedented cultural shift that completely inverted the studio's carefully constructed hierarchy. We have to talk about Spock Mania.
Spock Mania. This is where the history gets fascinating, because we see an established, comfortable leading man setup transform overnight into an existential threat to Shatner's entire career identity.
To understand Spock Mania, you have to look at the cultural tectonic plates shifting beneath the surface in the late 1960s.
Right. The traditional mid-century bravado that Shatner's character represented was very much the ideal of the 1950s and the early Kennedy era.
The man of action who punches his way out of problems.
Exactly. But by 1967, the youth culture, the anti-war movement, and the academic counterculture were surging.
And that new demographic didn't resonate with the swaggering hero. Instead, they suddenly and intensely latched onto the alien sidekick.
They saw themselves in his otherness, his repressed intellect, his struggle to balance cool logic with a chaotic, violent universe.
The numbers surrounding this shift are just staggering. When you look at the fan mail disparity, it is jaw-dropping.
Our historical record estimates that Nimoy's mail volume skyrocketed up to 1 million letters.
1 million. Just try to conceptualize that for you listening in 1967.
There is no email. There are no social media followers. This is 1 million physical envelopes delivered to a studio lot.
That volume vastly outpaced Shatner.
And the studio went into an absolute panic. The executives recognized that their secondary character was suddenly the primary draw.
But they were absolutely terrified of what this would do to their leading man's ego and his performance.
The documentation reveals that the studio actively hid the sheer volume of Nimoy's mail from Shatner.
They literally concealed giant canvas bags of letters in different departments.
Because they genuinely feared Shatner would suffer a psychological breakdown if he realized he was being so thoroughly eclipsed.
But at the exact same time, the studio was engaging in the most ridiculous nickel-and-dime pettiness with Nimoy.
Oh, this part drives me crazy.
Because he's getting 1 million letters, he is physically incapable of reading them all, let alone responding. He is forced to hire a secretary just to process the sheer volume of paper.
And the studio begrudgingly gives him a tiny allowance for the secretary, but they absolutely refuse to buy her basic office supplies.
It's absurd.
Nimoy had to buy his own pens and pencils out of pocket to answer the fan mail that was actively keeping the entire production on the air.
It perfectly illustrates the studio's desire to keep the outlier firmly in his designated place, even as the global public was elevating him.
Right.
But the absolute catalyst, the match thrown into the powder barrel, was a specific publication in 1967.
Oh, the Saturday Review piece.
Yes. The widely respected Saturday Review published a piece that explicitly argued the alien was the most compelling, interesting character on the screen.
And furthermore, the piece suggested that the alien should actually be the captain of the ship. Have you ever worked in an office where a manager takes credit for your presentation, or where your entire sense of professional worth is tied to a specific title and suddenly a junior employee is getting all the accolades?
It's a horrible feeling.
Now multiply that feeling by 1 million viewers. Put yourself in Shatner's shoes. You are a classically trained actor. Your entire livelihood, your entire sense of self-worth in this grueling, terrifying industry is built on being the leading man. How do you process the very public reality that your sidekick is stealing the show? You've spent 15 years terrified of failing, carrying that immigrant survival anxiety. You finally get the starring role, and the guy with the fake ears is getting magazine articles saying he should have your job.
It's a lot to process.
So what does this all mean? Is it really just existential dread? Or is it the inherent entitlement of a leading man who feels the supporting cast are just props for his own glory?
It is a volatile mixture of both. The entitlement was standard for a 1960s star, but the dread was deeply personal. He processed it as a direct threat to his survival.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And what's crucial to examine here is how Shatner's internal psychological dread translated into external calculating tactics on the soundstage.
The bridge of the ship stopped being a collaborative artistic space and rapidly transformed into a theater of psychological warfare.
We really have to unpack the mechanics of this warfare, because the granular level of sabotage is wild. Shatner essentially adopted a zero-sum game mindset. In his head, the pie wasn't getting bigger. There's a finite amount of audience attention. Therefore, any attention focused on Nimoy was a direct theft of Shatner's relevance.
If the sidekick looked too smart, the hero looked weak.
Exactly. This mindset manifested in an environment of intense daily micromanagement. We have extensive accounts from the writers detailing Shatner's line counting.
Line counting?
He would meticulously review every new script, literally tallying the dialogue word by word.
You've got to be kidding me.
No. And if Nimoy had a long, eloquent sequence of scientific exposition, which, logically, is the fundamental job of a science officer, Shatner, would aggressively lobby the producers, arguing that the captain should be the one to deduce the solution.
And he would demand those exact lines be reassigned to him.
Yes.
There is a brilliant and infuriating account from the writer Norman Spinrad that highlights how destructive this was to the actual narrative.
Oh, I know the one.
Spinrad had constructed a scene with a very specific, classic dialogue flow. Kirk says a line, Spock reacts to that line, and then Kirk delivers the punchline.
It's a basic 3-beat rhythm: setup, reaction, payoff.
Exactly. But Shatner went to the producers and had Spock's middle reaction line deleted, purely to reduce Nimoy's word count.
It's so petty.
So they shoot the scene, and it completely fails. Kirk is essentially talking to himself, reacting to nothing, and looking completely insane.
Because the bridge of the dialogue is gone.
Right. Shatner actively sabotaged the rhythm of the entire scene just to win a petty mathematical game of word counting.
And the sabotage wasn't limited to the script pages. It extended to the physical space of the set, which is arguably even more invasive for an actor.
Right, because to understand this, you have to understand the technical constraints of 1960s television.
The film stock required massive amounts of light. The lighting grids were incredibly precise. Your visibility, and therefore your emotional resonance on screen, were entirely dependent on finding and standing in your key light.
Yeah, if you aren't in your key light, you are in shadow, which means you essentially aren't on television.
Precisely. Shatner would engage in these physical microaggressions, where he would subtly drift into Nimoy's key light during a take, physically blocking the illumination and plunging Nimoy into shadow.
That is just... wow. He would also alter the blocking, which is the pre-planned movement of the actors in a scene on the fly, without warning.
Right, he would physically maneuver himself during dialogue so that Nimoy was forced to either turn his back to the camera to address him, or break eye contact entirely.
Or Shatner would step just a few inches closer to the camera lens during a two-shot, subtly making himself appear physically larger and more commanding in the frame.
It is such a granular, exhausting level of territorial defense. You have to constantly fight for your physical right to exist in the scene.
And then there was the active listening sabotage, commonly referred to in the industry as mugging.
Right, because we discussed earlier how Nimoy was a method actor. Method acting relies heavily on the truth of the moment. You are trying to live the internal emotional reality of the scene.
So when Nimoy was delivering a complex monologue, he desperately needed his scene partner to give him a grounded, realistic reaction to anchor his performance.
Instead, Shatner would wildly overact his silent reactions in the background.
He would twitch, sigh dramatically, roll his eyes, shift his weight.
Anything involving motion to force the audience's eyes back to him while Nimoy was speaking.
It was incredibly destructive to Nimoy's artistic process because he was essentially acting against a brick wall that was constantly vibrating.
That's a great way to put it.
It reminds me of watching a basketball team where the veteran point guard absolutely refuses to pass the ball to the hot hand rookie out of pure ego.
Oh, yes.
The rookie is sinking three-pointers all night, the crowd loves him, but the veteran keeps driving the ball into double coverage just to prove it's still his team. It's mathematically bad for the team's success, but the ego demands it.
And this tension bled right off the soundstage and into the dressing rooms.
Oh, the bicycle prank. Nimoy used a bicycle to get around the massive studio lot quickly between setups. Shatner, just to mess with him and exert dominance, stole the bicycle and hid it in his own dressing room, chaining it up alongside his dogs.
It sounds like a petty middle school prank.
It really does. But the psychological result was a period of complete, icy silence between the two men. They refused to speak off camera.
This raises an important question about the nature of art and conflict. Because the supreme irony of all this genuine off-camera tension is that it actually elevated the final product.
Wait, how so?
Well, think about what the audience at home was seeing. They saw this stiff, slightly adversarial, deeply repressed dynamic between the captain and the science officer.
Oh, right.
Fans completely mistook the actor's real professional resentment for complex, brilliant character work.
That is wild.
They thought they were watching a highly nuanced portrayal of alien logic grating against human philosophy, when in reality, they were watching two actors who were furiously defending their career territory.
Which brings us to a massive turning point. Because you cannot have the two stars of a major network production locked in a silent, passive-aggressive war without it bleeding into the boardroom.
Definitely not.
As they approached the end of the first season and looked toward the second, Nimoy wasn't naive. He saw the million letters. He felt the cultural momentum. He knew exactly what his leverage was.
And he finally struck back against the studio hierarchy. But he did it purely financially.
The behind-the-scenes contract battles leading into Season 2 are a masterclass in Hollywood hardball. But we have to carefully separate the historical reality from the myths that circulated in the press at the time.
Right, because the rumors stated that Nimoy's agent was demanding an outrageous $9,000 a week and 20% of the gross profits.
Which mathematically would have made him significantly higher paid than Shatner, the leading man.
Exactly, which was never, ever going to happen in the 1960s studio system.
So what actually happened?
The historical record clarifies what actually transpired. Nimoy demanded a raise to $3,000 a week. After intense negotiations, he ultimately settled for $2,500.
Now, while that wasn't Shatner money, it was double his first season pay.
Crucially, the new contract included a $500 yearly escalation clause, vastly improved residual payouts for syndication, and perhaps the most satisfying victory.
The secretary allowance.
Yes, a guaranteed $100 weekly allowance for his secretary to handle that mountain of fan mail.
But the studio didn't just hand that over with a smile and a handshake. The executives played incredibly dirty.
Herb Solow and the creator of the show, Gene Roddenberry, were fully prepared to completely recast the role.
They actually sent Nimoy a formal legal ultimatum, ordering him to report to work immediately or face suspension, and a massive breach of contract lawsuit.
They were actively holding auditions, bringing in new actors to put the pointed ears on. They wanted to prove that the character was bigger than the actor.
And this is where the network, NBC, completely upended the studio's leverage.
Keep in mind, NBC originally hated the character. They fought the pointed ears from the very first pilot, fearing the character looked too demonic and would alienate religious viewers.
But when NBC executives heard rumors that the studio was threatening to replace Nimoy over a contract dispute, They went absolutely ballistic.
The network stepped in, overriding the studio executives, and told them, quote, "Research tells us he is the most popular part of the whole damn show."
NBC essentially forced the studio's hand, demanding they secure Nimoy at all costs.
Now, here is where we really need to look at the psychology of the workplace. Nimoy gets the money. He wins the boardroom battle.
But he still has to walk back onto that soundstage and deal with Shatner trying to steal his lines and block his lighting every single day.
Exactly. How do you defend yourself creatively when your scene partner is actively trying to erase you?
Nimoy was incredibly shrewd here. He recognized that he couldn't fight Shatner on Shatner's terms, he couldn't outshout him, and he couldn't outmuscle him for the camera.
So he utilized his character's intellectual domain to build a creative fortress around his role.
He began actively inventing character traits and physical gestures that were so specific, so deeply alien, that Shatner couldn't possibly co-opt them for the human captain.
This is brilliant. Explain the mechanics of this for us, because it's a masterstroke of defensive acting.
Okay, so Nimoy invented the Vulcan nerve pinch, a subtle, quiet way to incapacitate an enemy, which is completely contrary to Shatner's sweeping, dramatic fistfights.
Right.
He invented the live long and prosper salute, drawing directly from his Orthodox Jewish upbringing, specifically the Kohanic blessing.
By creating these unique, highly specific physical and cultural markers, he made the character much harder for Shatner to steal from.
Shatner couldn't suddenly do the salute. It wouldn't make narrative sense.
Furthermore, it made Nimoy entirely indispensable to the studio. You couldn't just put the ears on another actor, because Nimoy had infused the role with his own deeply personal cultural DNA.
He protected his territory through pure creative invention.
That is an incredible survival strategy. But the fallout from all this intense maneuvering, you simply can't contain that level of toxicity just between two people.
No, you can't. The dynamic between Shatner and Nimoy acted like radiation, seeping outward and creating massive collateral damage.
It hit the supporting cast, it alienated the writers, and eventually the entire production was so compromised that it took the fans to literally save the show from the brink.
The supporting cast bore a significant heavy brunt of this ego clash. Actors like George Takei, Walter Koenig, and Nichelle Nichols have expressed deep, lingering frustrations regarding Shatner's behavior during those years.
They felt entirely minimized. Their characters were often relegated to glorified background extras because Shatner demanded the narrative focus remain strictly on him.
Furthermore, the supporting cast was constantly delayed on set, sometimes for hours, because Shatner would halt production to personally approve the lighting and photography setups for his close-ups,
ensuring he was the sole focus of the visual composition.
Right. When you are a working actor, time is everything, and having your day held up so the star can check his jawline in the monitor breeds immense resentment.
Absolutely.
But the person I feel for the most in this entire history is DeForest Kelley. He played the passionate, humanistic doctor, and off-screen, he was effectively the heart and soul of the cast.
He was a true Southern gentleman, and he frequently acted as the unofficial mediator between all these clashing egos.
But because he was so open and empathetic, he ended up taking so much of the emotional shrapnel. There's a devastating story in our documentation, the dog incident.
It is a profound, albeit painful, example of the total lack of empathy that can develop in a star who is consumed by their own survival and status.
We want to make sure we're just reporting the historical record impartially here, so let's just lay out the facts. The story goes like this. DeForest Kelley had a beloved little chihuahua named Emily.
He adored this dog.
And there was a tragic freak accident at his home. The poor dog was running excitedly across the lawn, violently struck a metal sprinkler head, and died.
Kelley was utterly heartbroken.
He comes to work the next day, he is actively grieving, and he seeks out Shatner to tell him the story, looking for a moment of human connection and sympathy from his colleague.
And Shatner laughs.
He finds the bizarre physical mechanics of the accident amusing, and he actually laughs in the face of his grieving friend.
Kelley was so deeply offended, so profoundly hurt by this sociopathic lack of empathy, that he completely stopped speaking to Shatner off camera for nearly 2 years.
2 years. And what is incredibly telling about Shatner's psychology is his complete lack of awareness regarding the freeze-out.
Right, because in his later recollections and memoirs, Shatner repeatedly claims that Kelley was a, quote, great friend.
He fondly remembers playing elaborate practical jokes on him, like constantly popping his toast out of the toaster in the commissary so it wouldn't cook.
He genuinely seemed entirely oblivious to the deep emotional damage he had caused, mistaking surface-level set pranks for actual friendship.
I want you to hold on to that story of Shatner laughing at grief, because we are going to contrast it with something that happens decades later, and it will give you a massive aha moment about his emotional evolution.
But in the 1960s, it got so bad, the environment was so toxic, that the creator of the show, Gene Roddenberry, reached his absolute boiling point.
Oh man, the memo. In late 1967, he writes this furious, blistering, multi-page memo addressed directly to both Shatner and Nimoy.
He accuses them both of dividing up the market on selfishness and egocentricity.
He brutally tells Shatner that his frantic, paranoid concern over stealing lines is actively sabotaging the morale of the entire soundstage.
And he turns to Nimoy and tells him that his lack of gratitude for his sudden, immense fame is appalling.
He basically tells these two adult men to grow up and do their jobs.
Roddenberry was desperate. The creative engine of the show was stalling because every script was being torn apart by this infighting.
The documentation shows that Roddenberry actually sought out the advice of the legendary science fiction author Isaac Asimov.
He asked Asimov how to handle this impossible ego dynamic.
And Asimov's advice was brilliantly pragmatic. He told Roddenberry, write episodes where the captain gets split into two different people, or write scripts where he loses his memory, or gets possessed by an alien entity.
Asimov recognized that you had to give Shatner such complex, scenery-chewing material that his massive ego was completely occupied.
Keep him so frantically busy acting out multiple personalities that he simply doesn't have the energy left to harass Nimoy.
It's incredible. Just give the toddler a shiny, complicated toy so he stops hitting his brother. It's brilliant management.
But despite all of this internal drama and creative maneuvering, the ratings were struggling. By the end of season 2, the network was absolutely ready to pull the plug.
And this is where the fans intervene in a way that had quite literally never happened in the history of television.
The fan rescue, primarily orchestrated by a couple named Bijo and John Trimble, is a legendary moment in pop culture history.
They mobilized the burgeoning, passionate fan base using nothing but a mimeograph machine and incredible logistical foresight. They initiated what they called the Rule of 10.
Let's explain the Rule of 10, because when you look at how information spreads today, this is essentially the grandfather of going viral.
Exactly. The Trimbles mailed a well-crafted letter to their extensive network of science fiction fans. The letter instructed every recipient to write a polite letter of support to NBC.
But the crucial mechanic was the second step. The recipient then had to ask 10 of their friends to do the same.
Those 10 friends were instructed to ask 10 more.
Furthermore, the Trimbles were explicit. They didn't want angry, scrawled petitions. They demanded polite, professional, business-formatted letters. They wanted to prove the quality of the audience.
And the execution of this was flawless. You had engineering students from Caltech organizing actual protests outside the NBC studios in Burbank.
And the mailroom at NBC just collapsed under the weight of it. To put this in perspective, a major network at that time usually received maybe 50,000 pieces of mail a year for all of its programming combined.
Suddenly, NBC is receiving estimates of anywhere from 200,000 to over 1 million letters solely for this one struggling science fiction show.
But it wasn't just the volume. It was the demographic revelation that terrified the executives.
When they opened these professional letters, they realized these weren't children writing in crayon. These were doctors, aerospace scientists, professors, and highly educated professionals.
The pressure from this elite demographic was so immense that NBC was forced to make an unprecedented move. They broadcast a voiceover announcement during the primetime closing credits of an episode, basically begging the fans to stop writing because the show had officially been renewed for season 3.
The fans won the battle, but the network won the war. The third season was moved to a terrible Friday night death slot, the budget was slashed, and the show was ultimately canceled in 1969.
And this cancellation, ironically, is the exact mechanism that forged the incredible bond between Shatner and Nimoy.
Let's transition into this new era. From bitter, territorial rivals to brothers.
Because the cancellation of the show threw them both out of the boardroom and into the exact same leaking lifeboat.
The alpha leading man and the outlier sidekick were suddenly stripped of their hierarchical titles. There were just two unemployed, heavily typecast actors trying to pay their mortgages in the 1970s.
It was a massive ego death for both of them, and it was the great equalizer.
Throughout the 1970s, they found themselves navigating the emerging convention circuit. They were traveling together to these provincial hotels, dealing with the bizarre, unprecedented reality of standing in ballrooms with thousands of fans dressed in homemade uniforms.
They shared the profound humiliation of struggling to find mainstream, serious acting work while simultaneously being globally recognized icons.
Nimoy profoundly struggled with his identity and his relationship to the character during this time, famously writing the defensive autobiography titled I Am Not Spock, before eventually reconciling with the legacy and writing I Am Spock.
They are out there in the wilderness together, but the real permanent shift in their power dynamic, the thing that finally allowed them to truly be friends, happened when the cinematic revival began in the late 70s and 80s.
When they moved from television to feature films, the playing field finally leveled out completely.
When the studio decided to transition the franchise into massive feature films, the leverage shifted entirely into Nimoy's hands.
He initially had very little interest in returning. He felt he had moved on.
He eventually agreed to the first couple of films, but as the movie franchise progressed and became a box office juggernaut, Nimoy struck a massive blow for creative equality.
He outright refused to return for the third film unless he was allowed to direct it.
Which is a huge demand. And he got it. He directed the third film, and then he directed the fourth one, which turned out to be a massive mainstream box office hit.
The sidekick wasn't just stealing the scenes anymore. He was literally calling the shots.
And how did Shatner, the ultimate leading man, react to his former subordinate becoming a blockbuster director?
He utilized his contract. Shatner invoked what is known in the industry as a favored nations clause.
To clarify for you, a favored nations clause is essentially an ultimate parity agreement. It dictates that whatever terms, perks, or pay the other top-billed actor receives, you automatically receive the exact same thing.
It is the ultimate ego protection mechanism in Hollywood. So, if Nimoy got to direct, Shatner's contract demanded that he get to direct as well, which he did for the fifth film, The Final Frontier.
But what is truly fascinating here is the psychological result of this legal parity.
Because their contracts, their paychecks, and their creative control were finally legally equalized,
right,
it fundamentally destroyed the 1960s zero-sum game.
Shatner no longer had to fear Nimoy stealing his spotlight or threatening his survival because they were finally, undeniably standing on truly equal ground.
And once that professional terror was removed, once the immigrant survival anxiety was satiated by guaranteed millions in equal billing, you see this genuine, profound affection and mutual respect finally flourish.
They became each other's emotional lifelines. You see it in how they supported each other through immense, dark, personal struggles.
Nimoy was a functioning alcoholic during the 1960s TV run, a secret he kept incredibly well hidden for a long time.
Shatner supported him through his eventual recovery.
Later, Shatner faced immense tragedies in his own life, including the heartbreaking death of his third wife, who also suffered tragically from alcoholism.
Nimoy was there for him, warning him beforehand, supporting him through the grief afterward.
The depth of that support is staggering. Nimoy served as the best man at one of Shatner's weddings.
The bond became so profound over the decades that Shatner, a man who poignantly admitted in his writings that he barely knew what a true friend was for most of his life, realized that Leonard Nimoy was the only friend he ever truly had.
They shared a tribal connection, a shared Jewish immigrant history, and the entirely unique, isolated experience of being at the very center of a global pop culture phenomenon for decades.
Nobody else on Earth knew what their lives were like except each other.
Which brings us back to that aha moment you mentioned earlier.
Right. Think about the Shatner of the 1960s laughing at DeForest Kelley's dead dog. That was a man incapable of empathy, locked in his own ego.
And now look at the Shatner of the 1990s, broken by the tragedy of his wife's death, desperately needing and receiving the deep, empathetic support of Leonard Nimoy.
It shows an incredible capacity for human growth. But tragically, it also makes the final chapter of this history so utterly heartbreaking.
We arrive at the final rift.
After 50 years of shared history, after surviving typecasting, divorces, addictions, and vicious studio battles, this monumental relationship is destroyed by a surprisingly small boundary violation.
It is a devastating conclusion. It centers around a documentary project spanning 2011 and 2012.
Shatner was writing and directing a film called The Captains, traveling around and interviewing all the various actors who had played a captain in the franchise's long history.
Naturally, as part of the project, he asked Nimoy to participate and be interviewed.
And Nimoy says no. Inexplicably, he refuses.
There's no specific, detailed reason given in the historical record for the refusal. He just firmly declines to be in the documentary.
Right. Now, we must remember that Nimoy had always been fiercely, intensely protective of his image, his likeness, and his personal boundaries.
We discussed how he used that exact protectiveness to defend himself creatively in the 1960s. So when he says no to Shatner, it is a firm, established boundary.
But Shatner, perhaps reverting to some of those old 1960s blind spots where he viewed the world entirely through his own needs, assumed Nimoy was just kidding.
He later stated he thought it was just a small thing.
So what's Shatner do? He has his cameraman secretly film Nimoy while Nimoy is speaking on stage at a convention.
Shatner then takes that unauthorized, secretly obtained footage and includes it in his documentary without Nimoy's permission or knowledge.
For Nimoy, this was an absolute unforgivable betrayal.
It wasn't really about the footage itself being damaging. It was the blatant, disrespectful disregard for his explicitly expressed boundaries by the one person who was supposed to be his closest, most trusted friend.
The reaction from Nimoy was absolute and severe. He instituted the freeze.
He completely cut off all communication with Shatner. No phone calls, no emails, no contact.
The suddenness of it is jarring, especially after 50 years. In a 2014 interview with Piers Morgan, which tragically ended up being one of Nimoy's last major public interviews, Morgan asks about his relationship with Shatner.
And Nimoy just coldly, flatly states, "We don't have that kind of relationship anymore. We used to."
It is just a devastatingly final, unyielding statement.
And the tragedy is that time simply ran out. Nimoy's health was rapidly declining from end-stage COPD.
He was increasingly tethered to oxygen tanks, slowly withdrawing from public life and preparing for the end.
Our documentation shows that Shatner did try to reach out as the end drew near. He wrote these deeply emotional, pleading letters.
He wrote, "You're the friend that I have known the longest and the deepest." He poured his heart out onto the page, desperately trying to repair this breach before it was too late.
But he received absolutely no reply. The freeze held.
Leonard Nimoy passed away in February 2015.
The silence remained unbroken to the very last moment.
And the tragedy of that silence was then compounded by a massive, vicious public backlash against Shatner, because when Nimoy's funeral happened, Shatner wasn't there.
The internet and the media absolutely crucified him for missing his best friend's funeral.
The public outcry was intense and judgmental. But when we look at the historical record impartially, we see that Shatner was honoring a prior, supposedly unbreakable commitment to appear at a major Red Cross charity fundraiser at Mar-a-Lago in Florida.
He chose to keep his long-standing promise to the charity event on Saturday night, rather than attempt to fly across the country at the last minute for the Sunday funeral in Los Angeles.
It was a practical, perhaps honorable decision regarding a charity commitment, but the optics of it, combined with the secret rift that the public was just learning about, fueled intense, lasting criticism.
You really see the depth of Shatner's lingering lack of emotional awareness, that tragic blind spot, in his 2016 biographical book, Leonard.
He writes openly about the freeze, and he admits that it remains a total mystery to him.
He still refers to the secret filming as a small, insignificant incident.
He genuinely, truly cannot comprehend why secretly filming his friend ended a 50-year brotherhood. It's a tragic inability to understand another person's boundaries.
But there is a tiny, incredibly poignant moment of grace at the very end of our documentation.
And Nimoy's daughter, Julie, eventually reached out to Shatner sometime after the funeral, and she gave him a vital piece of emotional closure.
She simply told him he really loved you.
It is a profoundly poignant end to a turbulent history. It shows that even beneath the unyielding silence and the strict boundaries of those final years, the deep foundation of their brotherhood remained intact, even if the bridge between them had burned down.
So as we wrap up this exploration, what does this massive history actually mean for us?
We've traced an incredible journey from two hungry, terrified immigrant kids to bitter rivals fighting a psychological war over camera lighting, to an unbreakable brotherhood forged in unemployment, and finally into a tragic, unresolved silence.
I think it demonstrates that pop culture's most enduring, pristine symbols are almost always forged in the messiest, most complicated human realities.
The very friction and ego that nearly destroyed them in the 1960s is exactly what made their on-screen dynamics so electric and immortal.
I want to leave you with a philosophical thought to mull over as you go about your day.
When you look at the enduring fictional bond of the captain and the science officer, the absolute binary loyalty, the perfect symmetry of their friendship,
does knowing the tragic, unresolved, painfully human ending of their real-life relationship make that fictional bond more beautiful?
or just more heartbreaking?
That is the perfect question to leave hanging in the air.
You've been listening to Retro Celeb Talk. If you enjoyed our exploration of this fascinating history today, please make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on how ego and art collide, and whether you think true friendship can ever fully survive the pressures of Hollywood.
Until next time, take care.